be honest. There was a group at UC Davis that had some grants and were studying this, but basically sugar had kind of escaped a lot of people's thinking in terms of being a cause of gout, for example, but also even as a cause of obesity. It was sort of suppressed at that point. And so we started doing studies to try to understand how fructose could cause metabolic syndrome and what was the role of uric acid. Because, I mean, everybody was saying that the reason you got fat was because you were eating too many calories and you're eating too much sugar. And uric acid is a metabolite, but it's like an offshoot metabolite. It's not like part of the fructose metabolism in the standard sense. And it isn't like fructose is broken down to uric acid. What happens is that fructose consumes a little bit of ATP, and when it does, that degraded ATP turns into uric acid. So it's like a completely different pathway. So suddenly we started thinking, my God, fructose is actually playing a role in metabolic syndrome, and uric acid somehow driving part of it. So then the question was, how was the uric acid working? Because we didn't think it was just through the renin-angiotensin system, but we knew that it inhibited nitric oxide. And I was aware that mice that had endothelial nitric oxide knocked out developed features of metabolic syndrome. And so it's called the eNOS knockout. But basically, if a mouse doesn't make enough nitric oxide, they can develop features of metabolic syndrome. So we thought, wow, maybe that's how it's working. And as you probably, I'm sure, know, nitric oxide, one of the ways that glucose is taken up in muscle, part of it requires a little bit of vasodilation, and the blood vessels have to be, dilate a little bit to help deliver the glucose to the muscle. And if you just inhibit that component, that can cause a little bit of insulin resistance. And so we actually did some studies like this, and so we found that insulin can stimulate nitric oxide in endothelial cells, but when we treated them with uric acid, it blocked the nitric oxide production. And so we began to realize that it could partly involve this pathway. But actually it turned out that it was a much bigger pathway than we had imagined. But when we first started, we thought it was just nitric oxide.
But going back to 2003, early in the day, that was a time when fructose was the safer sugar because fructose did not immediately increase insulin. It didn't require insulin for its metabolism. And it was, dare I say, even promoted by groups interested in giving information to diabetics. But the messaging was that fructose is the safer sugar.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So when, table sugar consists of both glucose and fructose bound together. And the glucose, of course, stimulates insulin, and insulin can drive fat production. So there was a lot of thinking that the glucose component of sugar was the bad guy. And fructose actually doesn't stimulate insulin. And when you give fructose to an animal or to a human, glucose goes up a little bit, but it can often be delayed, and it's not very much. And so it's actually what we call a low glycemic carbohydrate. So the fact that it's low glycemic and it didn't stimulate insulin, it was sort of surprising that it might actually have a role in diabetes, because it seemed like it should be a safe sugar for diabetes. But when you give fructose to animals, over time they become severely insulin resistant. They become resistant to the effects of insulin, and the glucose levels go up. And so you end up with a high insulin, high glucose state when you chronically feed an animal fructose. But if you just give it a single dose, neither glucose goes up or insulin goes up. So it's a little bit of a paradox. So I started thinking, could this epidemic of high blood pressure and obesity and diabetes be related to uric acid? And what I found was that this epidemic of obesity, although everyone had talked about it as starting in the 1970s, you could trace it back to 1890. That's right around 1890 was the turning point. I call it the tipping point. The obesity was seen in about 2 to 3% of people in 1890, and it was already rising by 1905, 1920, 1940. And the same thing was true for diabetes. Diabetes was like 2 cases per 100,000 people in 1890. That's what, you know, Sir William Osler wrote in his textbook. And then it started to increase dramatically into the 20s and the 40s and the 50s. And the same thing was true for high blood pressure. High blood pressure was actually rare back in 1905. And Janeway, who studied this, 500 people, said there was only like 3 to 5% of people had high blood pressure back then. And so there was this real dramatic rise over the last century. And I started looking at uric acid levels, and they also turned out, the
Right.
trouble was there was different assays way back when, but in around 1920 they started measuring it. And then a new assay came up in 1930, and that assay actually has been used routinely since then. And it's very easy to show that uric acid levels went from about 3 milligrams percent in 1920 to an average of like 5.5 or 6 milligrams percent like now. So it's been going up. So then the question is, why is the uric acid going up? Is it because it's going up because of obesity and diabetes and high blood pressure, or is it going up because of something else? And the big thing that controls uric acid, one of the major controllers, is diet. So I immediately thought, it's going to be purines. It's going to be. We've all been told that when I was in medical school, they said, well, uric acid is driven by purines, high purine diets. So things like beer, which has yeast in the beer, and red meats and things like this should be the primary driver. But when I looked, the red meat intake was actually flat, or actually tended to go down a little bit, depending upon which decade. I mean, it did not correlate at all. But I was aware, as you are, that sugar, sugar, and particularly fructose, the component of table sugar, can raise uric acid. And, it was known by Osler. Osler knew that sugar raised uric acid. He said, avoid sweets if you have gout. This is like 1890. People were writing about it, but, it kind of fell off the map, and everybody was thinking it was purines when I was around doing this. And so the idea, the thought was that maybe could it be fructose? Could it be sugar? So I decided to do an experiment. And I gave sugar. Actually, it was done by Taka Nakagawa in our group. He was a Japanese visiting scientist. And he gave sugar to rats. And, over time, and he gave fructose to rats. And over time, they became obese and pre-diabetic, and they developed metabolic syndrome, but their blood pressure went up. And the original theory, David, was that we were going to lower the blood pressure, and that was the reason for this epidemic of high blood pressure. But what we found is that when we lowered the uric acid, the blood pressure improved. But guess what? The triglycerides were less in the blood. The insulin levels came down. The glucose levels were less. The fat in the liver was less. And even the weight gain was affected in the first study, not so much, but in subsequent studies, yes. And so we realized that when we were lowering uric acid, we weren't just improving blood pressure. We were like improving the metabolic syndrome. And what's more, as I looked at it, I became convinced that fructose and sugar was like the main driver of obesity. And this was like 2003. There weren't many people looking at it back then. So we knew that the renin-angiotensin system was involved in uric acid, but we also had some experimental data suggesting that this system called nitric oxide was being inhibited. And as you know, nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It's produced by the endothelium. It keeps the blood vessels healthy. And the people who discovered nitric oxide, 3 of them got the Nobel Prize. So it's a very important system that keeps the body healthy. And it keeps the blood vessels dilated and blocks inflammation in the blood vessels. It blocks clotting. It's really an amazingly important system. And in young people, nitric oxide levels are high, endothelial function tends to be good. But as we develop kidney disease, or as we develop high blood pressure, or as we develop diabetes, this endothelial function is hurt. So what we started looking at, and we discovered that when the uric acid was high, endothelial function tended to be poor. And there was even a paper in the JAMA, I think it was in the JAMA, that looked at circadian rhythm, and they found that when uric acid goes up in early morning, nitric oxide levels fall, and there seems to be a circadian rhythm to it as well. And when we put uric acid on cells, like endothelial cells, we could block nitric oxide. What was fascinating, David, is it does it multiple ways. It does it by working on the transport of arginine. It works on it by blocking the enzyme. It can scavenge nitric oxide itself. We found that it actually binds nitric oxide. I mean, it really has multiple ways of reducing nitric oxide. And our group wasn't the only group that looked at this. Other groups confirmed it, and there are multiple mechanisms. And if we can increase nitric oxide, it turns out we could actually, when we increase nitric oxide, we could block some of the effects of uric acid, such as, for example, hypertension. And what we found, as I said, was that initially the high blood pressure was associated with a high uric acid and was driven by the uric acid. But over time, the kidney took over, and then you could lower the uric acid and the high blood pressure persisted. So what was interesting is that in humans, there's this fair amount of data supporting that uric acid tends to be high with new onset hypertension. And especially, and then over time, it can stay high or it can come down to normal. But basically, we realized that if we're going to look to see if uric acid was important in hypertension, we would want to begin with studying people who have new onset hypertension, where it's not been so long that they start developing kidney damage. You probably know, many, many years ago, pediatric hypertension was mainly a congenital problem, kidney damage or
renal artery
if you're born with, a single kidney or fibromuscular dysplasia. It was all what we call secondary hypertension. But as obesity started to increase, including in children, suddenly things like type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure started becoming more common in adolescents. So his clinic was filled with children, many of them who were overweight and hypertensive, who had true primary hypertension. So I gave him a very simple question. I said, why don't you just go and look and measure the uric acid and see what it is? And he came back, a month or two later, and he showed me this graph, and there was a direct relationship of uric acid with blood pressure in these adolescents. And what's more, it was only true in the primary hypertensive. So kids who had normal blood pressure had low uric acid, and if you had secondary hypertension, you may or may not have a high uric acid. But if you had primary hypertension, what we call essential hypertension, the hypertension associated with obesity, the uric acid was elevated. And it was like 90% of these kids had high uric acids versus like less than 5% of the controls. So Dan got this idea that he would actually do a randomized controlled trial to see if lowering uric acid could lower blood pressure. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover design where adolescents, I think their average age was like 14 or 15, who had just been diagnosed with high blood pressure, were randomized to allopurinol, and then there was a washout, or placebo, and then there was a washout, and then they took the other drug or placebo. So everybody got treated both with placebo or allopurinol at different times. And what he found was, it was unbelievable. These were kids who had never been treated with hypertension. They had never received any medicine at all. These were pharmacologically naive. They just had high blood pressure, recently diagnosed, and 90% of them responded, 88% responded to lowering of uric acid. If we lowered the uric acid under 5, they became normotensive. And in the placebo arm, only 5% or so responded. It was dramatic. It was like, oh my God, how could this be? Could uric acid be a cause of hypertension?
So again, it's an interventional trial in humans. You give a drug that inhibits an enzyme that's involved in the production of uric acid from precursors, and lo and behold, uric acid level goes down and blood pressure goes down. How was that greeted by the mainstream when you published?
I mean, it was viewed as quite exciting. In the pediatric literature, there was already some associations of uric acid with hypertension that had been observed. And of course, the association was well known in the adult, but I think there was a fair amount of pushback, but the study was so well done that it got into JAMA. And, so it had a high visibility. And it has subsequently been very, very highly cited. Now, at the time, uric acid was not really considered very important. It was thought to be a waste product, basically, and it was certainly important in the disease gout when it crystallized in joints, but it really wasn't thought to be important in kidney disease. And in fact, there were many papers saying that although it's associated with kidney disease, it probably doesn't have a causal role. And but we thought to ourselves, maybe in patients who have gout or patients with high uric acid, small amounts of crystals could deposit in the kidney that could cause low-grade inflammation in the kidney, and that might make the kidney want to hold on to salt. So we started doing some experiments where we raised uric acid in animals, and so it turns out that humans have higher uric acid than other animals because we lack an enzyme called uricase. And uricase is an enzyme in the liver that degrades uric acid. So humans have a little bit higher uric acid than most other mammals. So in order to raise uric acid in a laboratory rat, we actually gave it this uricase inhibitor, thinking that we were going to get low-grade inflammation in the kidney and crystals, and that might cause high blood pressure. But what we found was that we did get high blood pressure. The animals became hypertensive when we raised uric acid, but when we looked in the kidneys, we didn't see any crystals at all. And so we had to face the fact that uric acid might actually cause hypertension in the rat. And, at that point, it was known that 25% of people, 30% of people with high blood pressure have a high uric acid. And if you have bad hypertension, it's like 50 or even 75%. And so it was sort of, a remarkable observation because it suggested that we might have found a cause of hypertension. We submitted our paper saying that, raising uric acid might actually raise blood pressure. And we had to be very careful. We sent it to Nature, and of course they were not interested because it was too provocative, really, because everybody had more or less thought of uric acid as being a waste product. And so we ended up publishing it in this journal called Hypertension, which is a nice journal. In 2000, I moved to Baylor in Houston, Texas. And while I was down there, we started doing some studies, and we had another discovery, which was that what happens is when the uric acid, when you raise it, it causes inflammation in the kidney, and then that raises the blood pressure. And if you lower the uric acid, you lower the inflammation and you lower the blood pressure. But we realized that there was another thing going on, which is that if you kept the inflammation going a long time, then the kidney drove the blood pressure even when you corrected the uric acid.